Greetings, Bermuda. My name is Aaron Hill. I'm joined by my brother and good friend, Mr. Ryan Robinson, Perinchief, and this is the Burt News COVID-19 special series. Ryan, how are you?
I'm feeling a lot better today. Ready to get my haircut. Everything's good. I can't complain over here. How about you, Aaron?
I can't complain. As per protocol, I think we should take this time to express our sincere condolences to the families of those who have lost loved ones to the COVID-19 virus, as well as extend our best wishes to those who are still recovering, and again, express our extreme gratitude to our essential workers who remain on the front lines protecting us.
Absolutely.
Ryan, we have a very special guest today, so I'll leave it to you to give that introduction and we'll get rolling.
Yes, absolutely. So thanks for that, Aaron. We'd like to welcome all of our listeners and viewers. As you will know, we started at 3 o'clock today because we have a special guest. So we'll save our recap of our past shows for when we finish with that particular guest, because we know that we only have a short amount of time. We're having today the Premier, the Honorable David Burt, who's given us the pleasure of gracing us with his presence, and we'll get him up on screen shortly. We have some questions prepared. We know that our listeners and viewers have some questions ready, and we're looking forward to having him here with us today.
So hopefully he's joining us momentarily. Here he is.
Hi,
Mr. Premier, how are you?
I'm present.
Okay.
I don't have a haircut yet, and as in any day in this job, it's nonstop. So between trying to get some things off and doing all the rest, but I'm here. How are you all?
Thank you, Premier, and we're glad that you can hear us okay. Now, Premier, we're mindful that we only have you for 30 minutes, and we're grateful to you for giving us this time so that we can ask some questions and have some engagement with the public. But without further ado, if you don't mind, we're going to cut straight to the chase today. So, Aaron, I know you had a few questions related to the health aspect of the immediate crisis response, and then I'm pretty sure that the rest of our interview today will probably center around the big question of the economy.
Yeah, so I guess we can get going. So, Mr. Premier, on the 8th of April, you had indicated that you had reviewed some modeling data and that if Bermudians didn't follow the rules, there was an estimated 700 deaths, the possibility, if we didn't follow those rules. The Honorable Kim Wilson had indicated that the epidemiological model highlighted by you was based on one drawn up by Public Health and Imperial College London, and that a Bermudianized version will be publicized soon. It's been 6 weeks since that date, Mr. Premier. When can we expect the release of the Bermudianized model?
I can't actually give you that answer. I don't know. I know that Dr. Miners has been working with the team. I will try to send a message during this call to find out and understand. But I think the broader case is that what we're looking at is to get something that is probably more in line with learning. And I think I indicated at that time that recognizing those models are imperfect, and they say that this is not a prediction but a projection, and so it's not a prediction of the future, but it's a projection of what will take place if certain measures are adhered to or not adhered to. And that was following an R number of 2.4, spreading in about 20% of cases that are caught being hospitalized, and of those cases, which ones get critical, and out of the cases that are critical, which ones end up succumbing to the virus. But we've learned a lot since that point in time. And we certainly know that not 20% of the persons inside the community, where we know there are so many asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic spreaders, are picked up in that. So I know that those are items which are currently being revised. Our view is to put that information not out just to the public, but basically share it. So not only doctors of math like Kevin Miners, but our actuaries in our insurance companies, et cetera, can also look and to refine that data. But I'll try to shoot a message off to Dr. Miners to find out where we are on that right now.
Well, appreciate that, Premier. And on that topic, I mean, we know that there is some work all across the globe now working on.
And I do want to say one thing, because I think it's important that the announcement on April 6th, there was then the public release of the stuff on the 24th that went on the website. So that was the first round about it. So I don't want to make it seem that it's been a full 6 weeks. There was the preliminary stuff that we got. We did publish the stuff at the press conference on the 24th where Daiwan was at that meeting, and that work has been going on with Dr. Miners. But I said I will try to get an answer for you.
Perfect. Thanks, Premier. I was referring to the press conference, the statement on the 8th of April, where you or the health minister had referenced that a Bermudianized version would be coming. So I guess what you're saying is that a few weeks later, there was actual full report released on the 24th, is it? Okay. And on the topic of vaccinations, we know that some work's being done across the globe with respect to vaccination. Some in the community have expressed concern that perhaps this government will enforce mandatory vaccinations. Is that something that you will consider? Are you personally favorable for mandatory vaccinations?
I think that vaccinations are a matter for persons and their doctors, and they can follow their own advice. What I can say is that in any type of place where you're trying to eliminate a threat of a particular virus, and if you don't necessarily have herd immunity, you always have the possibility of that virus reemerging. But the policy of the government of Bermuda is not for the total and complete elimination of the novel coronavirus, and therefore we're not going to follow a policy of complete and total elimination. Persons who are worried that the government is thinking about forcing a vaccine on people are persons who are just, and with respect, who like to worry about certain things which aren't necessarily expressed. We haven't said that. That's never been the policy of the government. And though there's very forceful debate on what vaccination should look like from one side to another, I know that if there is a vaccine, I'll most likely get a vaccine myself and for my family, but those are decisions that family members will make in conjunction with their doctors and their health professionals. And I don't like to try to play people's doctor.
Thanks, Premier. And Ryan, I'll probably hand it over to you there, but I think as we close up the health aspect of it, suffice to say that at least the model that we're operating under now, Premier, your government has done a great job in containing this virus. We have seen some deaths, but it has been a limited number, and the cases have significantly reduced over the past few weeks. So kudos to you and your team. Ryan, I'll hand it over to you so we can.
So, Premier, I mean, your government has generally been praised for its overall performance in dealing with the immediate response to the COVID-19 crisis. We've seen over 20 million out in unemployment benefits. You implemented a state of emergency to reduce the spread of COVID-19. Eron and I, as you've just heard, have definitely shared those sentiments on our last show when we spoke with Dr. Karika Weldon. But without a doubt, the bigger crisis we're now facing is the economy. And I'm pretty sure that's what's going to dominate the rest of our interview. So, I mean, before we get into our specific questions, very briefly, what's the latest on that? What is going on with the plan for economic recovery?
The plan for economic recovery is the best way to get economic recovery is to get economic activity. And that's the reason why we are opening more and more of the economy. And so our view is to make sure we can open up the economy open up our economy in the safest way possible and get persons back to work. So today we start phase 2. More persons are able to go back to work. Retail establishments open to see and receive customers, personal services, outdoor dining, liquor license establishments that previously had outdoor services, commercial tour boats and operators with limited service. So the most important thing is to start getting people back to work. And that's the first and most important view and vision of making sure that the economic crisis is not worse than the health crisis.
Okay, great. Now, Premier, yesterday, the Minister of Finance, Curtis Dickinson, announced the members of the government's new COVID-19 Economic Advisory Committee. He described it as comprising a diverse group of 11 local and global business and community leaders. Now, many of the individuals on this committee are established individuals that were already regularly in consultation with the Bermuda government. In fact, some of them were already members of the Bermuda First Group, and we know that Mr. Philip Butterfield, for example, earlier this year, already expressed his disappointment and the lack of impetus in your government's response to those recommendations made by the Bermuda First Advisory Group that he chairs. So I have two questions on that. Firstly, I'm seeing a lot of comments and concerns on social media that we're turning to the same established old guard for economic recovery solutions, but we're expecting new and out-of-the-box ideas. Why don't we see any young people or young innovators on this committee?
I think we need to make sure that we are clear as to what the Economic Advisory Council is for. And the Economic Advisory Council is providing advice to the Minister of Finance. The fact is that the government itself gets a number of bits of advice. The Minister of Finance, under his responsibility, is charged with the economy. And so from that particular perspective, I think it's very important that we recognize that insofar as economic advice, it's certainly a broad level of economic advice. And so from this instance, the role of the Economic Advisory Committee is to provide insight and advice on how to protect jobs during the economic crisis and focus on strategies for long-term recovery. The fact is that these are the people who are discussing. This doesn't mean that they're the sole bit of the visions of the ideas. I've received and put out on forum.gov.bm, making sure that in following with our platform pledges, that we put forward a place where individuals can go ahead and submit their answers, thoughts, and discussions. And there's been a lot of actual conversation that has taken place on forum.gov.bm. Anyone can go on there, submit their ideas and thoughts for economic recovery. And those things are the parts of the stuff which are coming in. But the Minister of Finance has picked this group to give him particular advice. He wanted persons from the international business community. He wanted people from the local business community. He wanted people from the hospitality sector. He wanted people from the union sector. He wanted people representing various factions and sectors to provide him that particular advice. And I'm happy that they're providing him that advice. And I thank them for joining. The fact is that Phil Butterfield and I speak about once a week. Bermuda First Technology Committee is engaged in the COVID-19 technology solutions. There's additional work which is taking place on the education side in consultation with the Minister of Education. So work continues in lots of various, I would say, bodies in giving the government suggestions to consider.
But certainly the people on this committee will also be expected to help and come up with new innovative solutions. I mean, what suggestions could these?
See, here's the thing. I'm going to disagree with you again. And I'm going to try to roll that back again, because I take exception to when we say, oh, we're looking to people on these committees to come with ideas. AR certainly needs to provide insight and advice to the Minister of Finance, but to assume that those persons are going to be the sole, I guess, arbiters are coming up with these ideas is wrong. The Minister of Finance, as I said, from the government, remember, this is people who are providing insight and advice to the Minister of Finance in his role as he's charged in managing the economy. The fact is that there are a number of solutions, suggestions, recommendations, which have come from the general public at large. That is through the website forum.gov.bn. So if there is a position where the government is saying going here, it might be the Minister of Finance will go to the Economic Advisory Council, his committee, and say, what is your thoughts and views on this? What are your thoughts and views on this particularly? And to make sure that we're doing consultation around those particular items. But I reject the view that we are going to take the full and specific lead. They are going to provide their ideas, their thoughts. They might also be asked to provide views and thoughts on things which may come from either the public or even from you, Ryan.
Mm-hmm. But certainly you would agree that the government would at least benefit from at least one or two young people or new fresh faces on this particular committee. I mean, throughout this crisis, you've stated yourself that we've relied heavily on the expertise of young Bermudians. We've had Dr. Karika Weldon, who's been leading the government's aggressive testing capabilities. She did that before she was age 30. She's your scientific advisor. We have Dr. Kevin Miners and Aaron Evans, who've been credited with Bermudanizing the model. So how can we be, for example, praising young Bermudians in their response to this crisis, but then simultaneously exclude them from the table?
I do not accept your position that they're excluded from the table, and I'll just leave it at that. If you do not accept the formation of the committee, that's perfectly fine. Okay. But I recognize that I do not, just like I guess I could say in the United Kingdom, that I don't get into the place of trying to tell my ministers to what advisors in order to pick. I'm not going to get in this particular position. The Minister of Finance has a specific need for his Economic Advisory Committee. Those are the persons of whom he chose to give him the particular advice. There'll be things that will circulate to them, and that process will happen. And I'm certain that they will provide good feedback. But as I go again to state that the ideas which come from the general public through our website, which we've established, forum.gov.bm, are going to be considered with that committee. And those are particular items. So I continue to encourage people to make their input there. And there's a large number of good ideas in there that are certainly under consideration.
Thank you for that response. What do you say to, go ahead, Aaron.
Well, I was just going to say on the issues of, I know that the Premier said that those young people are not excluded from the table. And just speaking of tables, there was this notion of everything is on the table. That was a response that you had given, Mr. Premier, with respect to what actions your government would take to stimulate the economy. We spoke with the Minister of Finance last week, and he said that, and I quote, everything is on the table except for those things which are not. Mr. Premier, you are ultimately the captain of the ship. And he gave us a frank answer to say, well, some issues like capital gains tax and corporation tax were not on the table. So can you give us an explanation and elaborate on some other matters that are quite frankly not on the table?
From economic perspective, I'm not going to speak for the Minister of Finance, whose job it is to provide his view to the cabinet on matters of dealing with finance advice. Our constitution is relatively specific, and our construct I would say, financial advice is there. So one of the things that I've learned in being in this job for 34 months is trying not to set government policy, not either immediate interviews, but also certainly not going to set government policy for my particular ministers who have responsibility in that particular section. The Minister of Finance has said that nothing is off the table. There are certainly discussions that will continue on a number of particular matters, but I also think that it's important that the public is recognized and remembered that we hear a lot about the fact that, wealth in this country is not taxed, etc., without reflecting on the fact that this Progressive Labour Party government was the first government in history that actually put a tax on local company dividends, which never existed before. And so that has raised a significant amount of revenue on untapped sources of wealth in this country, which were never previously taxed. And we felt that labor should not be the only things that are taxed. So there's certainly loopholes there. But we also have to remember when we move to other forms of taxation, which are more possibly wealth-based and not such as the rental tax and others, those were issues that were mostly criticized. So there's certainly space to move forward. I think that the economic challenges ahead allow us to do significant rebalancing. And I think that persons will go ahead and look and examine other particular matters. There's differing views as to whether or not you should go and look at, amending the Exempted Undertaking Tax Protection Act of 2016, which extends income tax protections for exempted companies up until 2035. There are some who believe that should be looked at. There's others who don't. I think that we're going to take a fair and balanced approach. But on the whole, I don't believe that if you set out a proposal and a promise to people that it makes sound economic sense to change that. Because if you do, then people will not believe any promise you make in the future.
So, Mr. Premier, and just by way of correction, the finance minister, yes, he did say everything's on the table, but he clarified by saying except for those things which are not. So I was hoping to get some clarity from you as to what matters are not on the table so far as you're concerned, because he actually tied you into it. And he said that you agree with him on that respect. He said the Premier is with me on this, that some things are not on the table, specifically as it relates to those taxes. So my question to you is, what are some of the things that are not on the table? And if we can identify what is not on the table, what actually is on the table?
Oh, Eron, I can't give you that answer. You've asked me already. I did not watch your interview with the Minister of Finance, so I'm not entirely certain of the context. But the Minister of Finance, I think, has been clear of the matters of which are under consideration. And from the government's perspective, I think the government has said that we're going to consider what all things which make economic sense. There are people who, as I said, I didn't listen to the conversation, so I can't necessarily speak. And I can't say that the Minister of Finance and I have sat down and said, these are the things that are up for discussion. These are the things that are not up for discussion. I think what the Minister of Finance has said is that everything is on the table.
Let me give you an example, Premier. So, for example, in past press conferences, you suggested that if the private sector did not do more to assist, then government would step in and take legislative measures if necessary.
Yes.
When we asked Minister Dickinson last week, he suggested that he was not in favor of legislative amendments. And we also asked about, for example, the tax structure. And he said that he also thought
legislative amendments for what?
Legislative amendments in relation to anything affecting private business
rates.
Interest
Electricity
rates, Balco, electricity, international business, wealth tax. He just said plainly he was not in favor of any legislative amendments or drastic overhauls of the tax structure. So we're trying to get an understanding of what are your thoughts on this apparent difference in stance taken between, for example, what Minister Dickinson indicated and what you're saying regarding everything being on the table.
I actually don't believe there is a difference in stance at all. And I think that what is important is that ministers will never engage in trying to make public policy during television interviews. And I know there's propensity for persons to try to do that. The conversations of which the Minister of Finance has had and the government and the conversations and press conferences of which we've had are clearly and broadly reflected in the government's view. And that is the fact that if the private sector does not act, then the government will have to make laws to that particular effect. And what I will say is that it is also the case that sometimes private conversations will remain private and will not become subject to the media.
So Mr. Premier, Ryan, do you have a follow-up to that? I don't want to cut you off.
No, you can go ahead, Eron.
Okay, I just want to ask you a question that I hope you can answer because it was your response in a press conference last week, or sorry, the week before last, on the topic of recreational cannabis. In response to a question as to whether or not that legislation would be expedited, you said, and I quote, some things that were on the front burner before will now be on the back burner. But Mr. Premier, given that 2,000 hotel employees are out of work, that the Bermuda leisure air visitors fell by 43.5% in Q1 of 2020, and leisure spending, tourism leisure spending dropped 38% in Q1 of 2020, would you agree that the massive economic stimulus that recreational cannabis can provide should mean that recreational cannabis legislation should be on the front burner when we're looking at building a post-COVID-19 Bermuda?
Eron, I'm going to be nice and kind with you right now. You have
I would hope so, Mr. Premier.
You have a propensity to use your questions to make false assumptions inside of your question. So your assumption is that I said that cannabis legislation is not on the front burner. What is clear is that it was something that the AG had wanted to get to the Senate in May. But because of the fact that there were different things that were happening with the coronavirus, there were lots of things which were scheduled to happen at that particular point in time, which certainly got pushed back in order to make sure that we could make amendments to law, do different things to make sure we're taken out to quarantine, dealing with shelter issues, all the rest. So there are lots of different things. So the premise and assumption of which you're making from my question and then rolling that into another thing, I don't think is helpful. I think you're trying to mix up two particular issues. I have been clear in my delegates conference speech of where we are. The government does not, I don't accept this word recreational cannabis. What we've said is that we'll have a local regulated cannabis market. I know that those particular matters are advancing. The ministerial statement, which the Attorney General made in March prior to this particular crisis occurring, is still the stance of the particular government, and those particular items are moving forward. But I do not accept that that if you all of a sudden had recreational cannabis in Bermuda, 2,000 hotel workers are going to be back to work. I'm sorry. People in the United States, which are our main tourism thing, can go to the next state where they're not going to require to be quarantined inside of a hotel or somewhere else for 14 days in order to, get high. So from that particular perspective, I don't necessarily think that one and the other. But we've been clear on our particular perspective. I was clear in my delegates conference speech of the policy, position, and movement of the government insofar as establishing a regulated cannabis regime with domestic production, et cetera. And the minister, I think the Attorney General, was very clear. And I know that there will be things that are coming to consideration of cabinet in the near future. And I'm sure that there will be updates on that. But I just want to say, as a broader point, I guess, is that I don't want us to believe that tomorrow, and I'm not going to get across this idea that tomorrow, if all of a sudden I said that, everyone can grow their own weed and smoke it and sell it, that 2,000 hotel workers aren't going to be able to work. They are.
Right. So, Mr. Premier, just transitioning to the Bermuda Infrastructure Fund, you announced it in November 2017, and that was the brainchild of Mr. Brian Duper. We'll probably have a follow-up with respect to Caroline Bay. But you announced that this fund will be supported by a $100 million investment from various members of Bermuda's insurance industry, and that the new fund would create jobs and boost the local economy through major construction projects. Can you give us an update on where we are with the BIF and what specific role it will play in COVID-19 recovery?
I'm not sure what role it'll play with COVID-19 recovery. I know that they've made a number of large and small investments. There are certain things which are pending before the government on matters dealing with vertical farming, which is supported by the Bermuda Infrastructure Fund. I know they've also committed to an investment in a local technology company that's going through a regulatory process as well. Insofar as public infrastructure, the government has not relied on the Bermuda Infrastructure Fund for public infrastructure projects. Bermuda Infrastructure Fund requires a 10% return on its equity investments. That's the basis there. On some projects, they do less. And in some particular case and instances, the government, which can borrow money at 4%, will find it more economical for us to borrow money at 4% versus borrowing money from the Bermuda Infrastructure Fund at 10%. But I think that they, as I said, it's something that's sponsored by the government. And the main thing from the government's perspective is that if the Bermuda Infrastructure Fund were to make investments in companies, that those companies would, that portion of the investment would be technically exempt from the 60-40 rule. And so for the most part, we've been able to, make that happen. But for the fund itself, it is a privately run fund. So it's administered by Fortress Investments. It is the money of local insurers that have committed funds there. But I know that, as I said, they have two pending proposals, one for a vertical farming proposal, and the other, I know they've made a investment in a local technology company. But I think that their things are more for private infrastructure projects, such as telecommunications, such as the vertical farming issues. And I think they also did something for a local transportation company as well.
Thanks, Premier. Eron mentioned Carolyn Bay. We've seen a lot of back and forth lately surrounding the Carolyn Bay deal at Morgan's Point. And for example, during our interview with the finance minister last week, we briefly spoke about how government actually had to raise the debt ceiling and other brief topics surrounding what's going on with the future of that. In other op-eds, the finance minister also spoke about how there are many questions left unanswered, as this was a bad deal from the start, which left taxpayers out of pocket to the tune of over 165 million. Now, as we talk about economic recovery and the government's deficit, I'm sure that 165 million could have been put to very good use. Why hasn't this government called a commission of inquiry into the Carolyn Bay deal and how the Bermudian taxpayer was exposed to this astronomical debt in excess of 165 million?
Commission inquiries cost money, and I don't necessarily think that commission inquiry is responsible for everything. I think that it's one of those fashionable items where, because there was a commission inquiry called by last government, that we want to have a commission inquiry to everything. The question is, what is the problem which we're trying to solve? The problem which we're trying to solve in this particular instance is that the deal that was made by the former government was a bad deal. I don't think we need a commission inquiry to tell us that. It was a bad deal. And so for that particular case and instance, we know precisely what it is. And I think we have other types of government bodies, whether it be the House of Assembly to do an investigation or other things that don't necessarily need and or require a commission of inquiry. The fact is that it was a bad deal. It was a deal that the government, when we were in opposition, we did not support. We came into government. I remember Mr. Duperl had come to my office to ask us in 2018, I want to say, when I was the Minister of Finance, to increase the guarantee, or else there'll be a whole lot of people out of work. And I said, no, I will not increase the guarantee. It would not be consistent with me to not support this project in opposition, and now being in government to go ahead and do it. A project should be able to stand on its own merits. The project was able to be funded for a little bit. They kept on saying they were going to get new funders. They haven't got new funders, and the Minister of Finance is where we are currently. It is a very sad situation. The fact that the former government and the former Minister of Finance would say if he had to do the deal, he would do it all over again. Those are things he says in public, while in private, he says that, other things should happen. The entire project itself is very bad, and it is a perfect example as to why the government should not be giving out guarantees willy-nilly. And if you have to give out a guarantee, you have to make sure that it has the proper necessary requisite backing. So we've taken these steps. We had to take these particular steps because the fact is that the credit rating of the government of Bermuda stands for something. And if you then default on obligations, which we were legally binded to do, that would mean that any future obligations of which we made would be viewed with a particular amount of risk. And a reduction in the country's credit rating means an increase in every one of the country's interest rates. And I'm quite certain that as high as our interest rates are, we don't want to actually make sure we don't want to see them going up any further.
Mr. Premier, I tend to agree with you. I don't think that there's a need for a commission of inquiry. As you said, we all know that it was a bad deal. You said two things. You said something else also about a position that you adopted in opposition and that you felt it would be the right thing to do to adopt the same position whilst in government. And on that matter, we know that it's a bad deal. We know that it cost the taxpayer over $165 million in debt. Why don't we just take that land back? Section 13 of the Constitution permits us to do that. And whilst in opposition, I know that you had a different position when the other party took a position with respect to taking land back. But now we've identified it's a bad deal. It's cost the taxpayer over $165 million. Why don't we just exercise that right, Mr. Premier?
Well, there's lots of different things, but you too, as persons who study law, know that the law is not that cut and dry. So what I'm going to say is one of the things I like to you, Eron, is I'm certainly not going to make public policy on an interview. And some of the discussions might be excellent for a commentary program. But anything that I actually say is relied on inside of courts and other types of places. So I'm going to be very, very careful with my words. Very careful with my words, but I would say that I think that the Minister of Finance has done a great job. I think his team is looking through this in a methodical fashion. And I think that we have the very plain and simple objective of making sure that the people of this country get their money back. And we're not going to be unabashed. It was not a deal that we made, but it's certainly something that we're going to follow up through. And we're not going to exercise fear or favor, because the only thing that matters inside this country is that I have $185 million that I cannot borrow due to a deal that I did not make, which right now inside this country could be far more beneficial and be used, especially insofar as rebuilding and different things. So that's the challenge we have. And it's unfortunate where we are, but I think that you would recognize that the government is approaching this particular situation with a level of discipline. And, Brian Duperreault is a highly regarded figure in Bermuda. And so it's the fact that the government is basically saying what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And we're going to make sure that we take action to protect our interests, no matter who is the person on the other side. And I happen to know Mr. Duperreault. I happen to know his wife very well and regard them as friends. This is the challenge in dealing with this job. We always have to separate the personal from the business. And in this particular case and instance, we have 65,000 people who are relying on us, and the Minister of Finance is acting in the best interest of all taxpayers.
Okay, thank you very much.
From someone about affordable housing and
cost. Yeah, I'm mindful that we have about 5 minutes left. We're going to get some reader questions up. Let's talk cost of living. So Dulcina Bean Burrows asks, affordable housing and the cost of food are the biggest determinants of health and economic well-being. What specific objectives does this government hope to achieve to address these issues in light of our present situation?
Cost of living breaks down into 4 factors. Cost of healthcare, which is something that is looked at the government's view to address through the Bermuda Health Plan, trying to make sure that we have more equitable healthcare and putting everyone in one insurance pool, something that is an incredibly progressive reform, a change in which we've made the first time in 50 years, the Health Insurance Act, 49 years. The Health Insurance Act required all health insurers, approved health insurers, to collect mandatory government benefits, but did not have to remit all the money of which they collected to support the hospital and public health care initiatives. And we've decided to make sure that we change that. The other part of cost of living is dealing with energy. Energy is something that is particularly challenging, particularly, I would say, challenging for us. But we do know that with global energy prices that are falling, there was going to be some movement there. There's also consideration as to whether or not there could be some different things insofar as tax policy that can be done to bring particular relief on the cost of energy. But those are 2 particular matters that deal. There's 4 factors of cost of living. The other 2 factors of cost of living are housing and food. Housing, we have a specific plan for. My view for housing is it's not radical. It's the thing is that and this is why I always focus on when we talk about any type of policy. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? The problem that we're trying to solve in Bermuda is that housing is too expensive. So we have to examine why is housing too expensive. There are 2 reasons that housing is too expensive in Bermuda. One reason is that there is lack of supply of right-sized living apartments for persons. So Dennis Pitch will always give this graph that we've constructed so many 2- and 3-bedroom apartments, but we've constructed minimal studio and 1-bedroom apartments. So there's a lack of supply of certain types of apartments. The other issue why housing is so expensive in Bermuda is because of our rules and our immigration policy, which does not allow for persons who are here and guest workers to own properties or companies to own properties. What happens is that companies then give rental allowances to their staff, which then causes the price of rental properties to increase, which causes all those particular things to increase. And in that particular case and instance, that's what's driving up that cost. So in order to counteract that, you have to find a way to allow these particular individuals to not artificially raise the price of the housing market so that proceeds can be more affordable across the board. Now, there's 2 different aspects to that. Number 1, for landlords and people who rely on inflated exempted company rents in order to make their things, that's something that is like, oh my God, don't touch that. But in a broader sense, that causes more pain inside of the economy. And so from that particular perspective, this is why we made that change in late last year, where we said that for approved residential projects in the economic empowerment zones, they can be owned without restriction. And the view for that is to stimulate construction, to make sure that we can reduce the amount of inflated rents inside of the country. And that will mean that there will be lower prices. In addition to that, we have to make sure that we allow persons to get to the housing ladder and also to reduce the cost rates on mortgages so that housing can be more affordable. So that's the issue on housing affordability.
Thank you. Now,
I won't touch food then. I'll just touch housing because I know we've got.
Go ahead really briefly. I know that we're pressed for time.
Ryan, you know very well that I'm very difficult for me to be brief in my comments. So on the issue of food, we have to make sure that we have to use technology to be cooperative insofar as buying. One of the things which we're going to do tomorrow, we're tabling in the House of Assembly amendments to the Cost of Living Commission Act, which will require grocery stores to submit certain prices of staple goods electronically to the government of Bermuda. One of the things that you can do on pricing is to make sure you have price transparency. That's the first issue. The next issue is that we will, and there are early discussions, and I'm trying not to make public policy inside of the interview on more collective buying of food from a government level, possibly on certain projects such as financial assistance and others, to make sure that we can use that power to bring cheaper costs and allow other persons to buy into those cooperatives.
Well, we look forward to seeing the results of that. Now, on energy, you mentioned briefly a tax relief. Throughout this crisis, many of the established utilities, for example, Belco, have continued to function with minimal interruptions. So, for example, the parent company of Belco announced an actual threefold increase in earnings for the first quarter at $4.1 million. So I know sometimes when we talk about the cost of living, we look at making it more affordable for those actual service providers. But in this particular case, Belco seems to have been doing okay.
Tax relief doesn't go to Belco. Tax relief goes directly to individuals that are in the fuel adjustment surcharge. So on that, you have to remember that Belco is a regulated industry. So anytime Belco reports earnings, that means that their rates actually go down because they're a fully regulated industry. So they're only allowed to return, I think they wanted to return 10%. I think the government said, no, you're not returning 10%. You're going to return a lower level. And that's the particular reason why we've seen that reduction in core energy rates. So energy in Bermuda is fully regulated. So any increase in profits at the utility means a decrease in price for people.
Okay, thank you. Eron, did you have another question?
Well, no, I know that the Premier's got to go, Mr. Premier. The Finance Minister undertook to come back on the show. We've had a great session today. Can we expect to see you back?
I'm happy to come back. I think there'll be more times. I think in the next month we'll have different issues that have come to light from the perspective of overall we're moving forward. So, I mean, I had a youth forum. I want to say it seems like forever ago, but I think it was probably in February. It was in February, and I think that the interaction with that was helpful. And person will know I have a lot of gray hair now, and I'm no longer considered youth, but I like to consider myself young at heart. And I just want to encourage the both of you to continue to be constructive in your commentary, continue to ask the tough and difficult questions of the leaders, because I think it's something that's helpful to challenge us. I'm not purposely evasive, but I will not make public policy on TV. And one of the things that I've actually learned over this job is that it's very dangerous to get in front of your ministers on issues of policy. And so I'm trying my best not to do that as we're not in crisis level, but on the issues of financial reform, economic reform, et cetera. I think that the government and the caucus itself is pretty clear that this right now is a unique opportunity to make significant changes. And we're certainly going to make some of those specific changes. This cannot be an issue where the people who have always had to pay for everything are the ones that are ending up paying again. And I think that there's going to be a broad consensus in the need to make fundamental changes. And if there's not a broad consensus, I think that we might have to have different discussions in this country about what's needed to get to that broad consensus, and a reminder that the elected government represents the will of the people. And sometimes people need to be reminded of that.
Okay,
well, Premier, thank you. Thank you for your time today. We appreciate the interview. It's certainly been informative.
I want to know why y'all ain't come back to my press conferences. What's going on?
We don't want to set policy inside of a conversation.
I thought the same thing, but I said, let me let Eron say it.
But we hope to be back. We hope to be back, Premier, and we look forward to welcoming you back on this discussion. I hope to be back during the press conferences. Yeah. But we'll let you go. We're going to engage some of the live viewers. But thank you again, Ryan. I don't know if you have any.
I add in with respect to the press conferences, they sort of go hand in hand with this particular show. So I know you don't have the time to particularly watch everything that we do on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but you'll see us. You haven't seen the last of us. Don't worry about that. We missed you too. And you'll probably be receiving something from us soon with respect to not only coming back on this particular series, but working with us together in the future to sort of keep this balanced dialogue going. So thank you very much, Premier Burt. We appreciate you taking out the time. You originally had 30 minutes. You extended that a little bit, and we're grateful. So we're looking forward to seeing you back again. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Absolutely. Have a nice one.
All right, bye-bye. Ryan, that was certainly an interesting interview. Interesting to say the least, but I think we've got a bit of time to say some more.
Yeah, I mean, that was a rapid fire interview. I know that when we had Minister Dickinson, he ended up staying for just over an hour, and we still didn't have enough time to cover everything. So we're grateful for the Premier for extending that 30 minutes or 40 minutes with us. And we haven't seen the last of them, folks. So thank you very much. Now, I think what we can do for the rest of this show, considering that our past series have gone on to last up to 2 hours, we can probably, Eron, take it up to the 1 hour, maybe 1 hour and 15-minute mark today by discussing a little bit and unpacking a bit of what we just discussed with the Premier, some of the questions we got to ask, some of the questions we didn't get to ask. And then this is where we'll also look to you, general members of the public who are watching. Perhaps we can get some discussion going. What did you guys, what did you think of that particular interview? Was there anything that stood out to you? We can see your comments, whether you're commenting on Facebook, YouTube, or Periscope. Feed them through. We'll get you up on the screen, and we'll continue having some discussion for the remainder of this show. Eron, let's start with you. What do you think about that interview?
Well, I think before we get into specific comments, I think the Premier deserves a tremendous amount of credit. It's certainly not an easy thing because he doesn't know what we're going to ask him. And so to get there, sit in front of a screen, and then be, have rapid fire succession of questions asked of you. And I think at first when you get the response that you're not going to make public policy inside of a press conference, and that was the first time I heard it, was when I was asking questions during the press conference. I think it was a bit off-putting, but I think that as you consider the role of the Premier and the fact that he has, I don't want to say hired ministers, but there are ministers responsible for various tasks, that it actually, I'm just imagining you and I, Ryan, you saying that you're the Premier and you've got a minister, and you say, well, Minister, this is your responsibility. And then I, as Minister, find out that you've said something on a press conference that's my job. So to some respect, I can appreciate that he doesn't want to get in front there. But, and there's always that but.
And that's the but.
You knew that but was coming.
Yeah.
You're the captain of the ship.
Can you stop taking my words? Let me say them. I want to say them. No, but I mean, honestly, I don't think anybody's looking for a particular law to be drafted right there in the room. But I don't see any issue in particular with fleshing out an idea, asking a question, and then taking a particular standpoint on the issue. I mean, if it's something that aligns with your party's ideology, for example, then I don't see any issue in making a commitment right there and then. I don't think that every decision needs to be discussed in the back room before you come and present it to the people, when there are certain things that, for example, to you and me, may seem like common sense. Now, of course, we're not privy to certain conversations which take place. Maybe there are certain undertakings or certain legal issues which have to be fleshed out before somebody makes a decision. So I certainly understand the Premier's point in that respect. But I do think that maybe when we talk about certain issues, it's not as it is a bit off-putting to say, we're not going to make policy if you're not particularly looking for policy. But
and then it begs the question about the team cohesiveness. Are we all on the same page? Because the fact that you are responsible for a task, you're executing the vision of this team. And I think that's something we can come to discuss when we look at, the democracy and the way that we have it structured here in Bermuda. But one would have thought that there would be a vision of the government, and that the ministers were merely executing that vision, not solely responsible for coming up with different visions as it relates to different headings and ministries of government. And so in that regard, when you're posed with a question like, for example, what is off of the table or what is on the table to stimulate the economy?
Those are things that have likely already been decided, and you're just informing the people.
Well, your words, captain of the ship, as you say, right? I asked the captain of the ship, hey, where are we heading? And you say, well, go and ask the man who's right. Looking up. No, you're the captain of the ship.
Yeah.
So
I agree with that. I mean, when I look at a press conference, right, or even this series, I sort of view it like a town hall, right? When you look at the state of emergency that's taken place over the past month or so, that was not only a press conference, it was really a town hall meeting. It was a sole opportunity for members of the public, and particularly the media, to come and ask questions and present certain viewpoints. And then we're all on Facebook. Everybody was watching on YouTube, the press conferences live, and we were engaging back and forth. So to me, it was a town hall meeting. And I certainly don't see an issue with making policy if we were to call it that at a town hall meeting, because that's what town hall meetings, in my view, should be for in a functional democracy. You have a particular issue on the table, everybody gathers around and you discuss and you debate. And the premier might just say, hey, that's a great idea. Let me at least think about that. So I take his point that certain things can't be discussed. However, I think we should be careful or cautious about using that as sort of a back foot stance for every particular thing that's presented.
Yeah, and I think that I do see some comments here with respect to that he's respecting the minister's purview and their responsibilities. But again, I think that ties into the fact that you have a collective vision. You laid out a platform as to what was going to be done.
Right, you're making it up. Well, you're not making it up as you go along.
There are certain things that you're certainly not going to do, and there are certain things that you have to do. And so if asked a question as to, is this something that this government, perhaps it's even saying, well, yes, the Minister of Finance is responsible for executing X, Y, and Z, as opposed to getting out in front. But I don't see the answers, because when you asked the finance minister, he said, well, everything's on the table except for that which is not. You ask the premier, he says everything's on the table. If you push past that, it's, well, that's the finance minister. So there's a bit of a circular motion going on here. But when we turn to the specific questions, Ryan, I thought it was particularly interesting when you talk about young Bermudians being active on the economic.
I like that. Yeah.
When you got on the economic, yeah.
Because I saw it at 3:17. So for those who are just joining us, the very first question I particularly asked to the premier was in relation to the Economic Advisory Committee that was just announced by Finance Minister Curtis Dickinson last night. I have been reading on Twitter, on social media, and I've gotten a lot of concerns from not just young people, but people generally, that there were no young people on that committee. Now, I don't mean to offend anybody. I don't know. Young is very subjective. However, I think there were a lot of concerns that this particular committee had established individuals on it from the reputable persons from the business community, but it didn't have sort of that young, bright, new blood spark in the room to help drive the dialogue. Talent Clark at 3:17, if we can get some of these up on screen, particularly said, thank you for that question. I know he appreciated it because there are many, and I know that Talent, for example, is a young entrepreneur. He runs Rugged Rentals, the rental vehicles. And these are some of the examples of some of the young, innovative young people that we have out there, Bermudians, that I think need to be in the room when we have these sorts of conversations. There was a response by Lizzie Peckett that said the reason they don't use that many young people is that they don't have the experience. And I mean, I have to disagree with you there, Lizzie, because when you look at the other young people that have been driving policy and driving change in government's response to this crisis, Dr. Karika Weldon turned 30 years old last week. She's a very young Bermudian. She's a young Bermudian, and that certainly doesn't correspond to a lack of experience. In other instances, I think lack of experience may just be a good thing. If we're talking, as the premier has stated, about everything being on the table and doing things that we've never done before, then we need people and we need ideas that we've never considered before. So I was a bit disheartened to sort of hear that question sort of put to just we already are going with these people and that's already a firm established thing, as opposed to at least having, if you have 11 people and you're going to call them diverse, you can get some young people on that committee. I don't particularly accept that.
We have an interesting concession from one of the commenters that says, I'm old and I was offended that there wasn't any young people in the panel. And the reality of it is, right, Ryan, that the decisions that are made today, we're going to inherit it as young people. We're inheriting, for better or for worse, we inherit the consequences of this decision. And so from that perspective alone, I would hope that, and I think we want to move past the criticism of the lack of youth membership on that committee to kind of give a suggestive possibility of what can occur. And let's say, I would hope that on reflection, the finance minister, the premier, and this government would perhaps gather a youth parallel to that committee, an economic advisory committee comprised of solely young people that works in tandem with the economic committee that he has. And that's perhaps something that they can consider, having now received that feedback and that constructive criticism.
Yeah, and it has to be done in a way, and some people will say I'm never satisfied, right? But I mean, I would hope that now that this concern is widespread, as we've seen, that there would be some more diversity on the committee. But then if that does come into place, that it's not done by way of tokenism, right? Because it's one thing to say we want young people on the committee. It's another thing to just plop one young person in the chair and say, here, we've done that. So I genuinely think the wider point that I was making here is, and it may go beyond this committee, but the idea is, if we're really having a conversation about a once in a lifetime event, you know, this is a pandemic that has hit us at a once in a lifetime, once in a century event, and that we have to take drastic measures in response, and we have to think outside of the box and do things that we've never done before, then that has to come from the top. And you can't establish a government committee and talk about how we're going to get out of this crisis, but then you see the same established faces. And that's nothing to discredit the people on that committee. I know Patrick Tannick, I know some of those people there. I know that Dennis Pitcher is doing great work with the FinTech Advisory Committee. So it has nothing against them as individuals. They're all established. But I think that establishment is very much a part of the issue. We need to get those people that you see ranting on Facebook from now and then, who you may not allow or have in the room at that particular time, or those people that you haven't thought of before, those young, fresh faces in the room.
And I think Ryan, there's to some extent, like, I support obviously what we've made the recommendation of having a youth committee, or a committee comprised of solely young people, right? But the reality of it is that we know what we're going to come to in some of the decisions that need to be made, right? So it's really about listening to the young people in the electorate, right? What exactly are we looking to stimulate our economy? What exactly are some of the alternatives? Because we mentioned the Bermuda Infrastructure Fund, and the Premier said, well, that's a private fund, but the government has obligations in it. You know, serious financial implications as to the minimum amount of investment that the government has to invest in this private fund, right? So you really look at it and you say, well, yes, there's a need to have these committees. Yes, there's a need to have young people a part of these committees. But at some point in time, I'm tired of hearing about committees. Let's make some action, because we've had, and I see a comment here with respect to the SAGE report. We've got
by Anna Pereira.
We've got the Infrastructure Fund. We've got the Bermuda Fresh Group have given recommendations. And the Bermuda Fresh Group came up earlier this year and said, well, the government are slow to act on the recommendations that we give. So how many reports are we going to get before we take some action?
But furthermore, I mean, when you look at some of the members on the committee, I mean, the Premier has said that their job is not to come up with ideas. So I think we need to get some more clarity on what exactly the purpose of this committee is. Are they there just to compile and consolidate information from the general public? Are they there to advise from a technicality point of view? Either way, I can't accept the position that there was no room at that table for a young person. Just make the committee more than 11 if you need to. But going back to what you've said, these are decisions that are going to affect us more than any other, because we're talking about going into more debt. We're talking about issues that are dealing with pensions and tax measures and pay cuts. You have to consider those people who are going to be left behind. So I think, yes, there needs to be political will to implement the current reports that we have, but also I don't see somebody who's been on the SAGE committee, who's been on the Bermuda Fresh Report committee, coming up with anything particularly new, considering that the Bermuda Fresh Report was done, a few months ago. We've just heard about it. So what new ideas have come to the table between January and the onset of this pandemic in March that haven't already been put out there? We need to be going and genuinely thinking outside the box and going beyond that and looking at those people who we have never, ever heard from before.
And I think the Premier made a comment with respect to this committee being under the sole remit of the Minister of Finance, and so that their professional expertise and opinions will be directed on looking at the economic stimulus. So perhaps hope springs eternal, that there is another committee that looks at how we actually are changing post-COVID, or Bermuda life post-COVID-19. So from an education perspective, because you would have to have young people on that committee, right? How do young people want to learn? How are young people going to learn in a post-COVID-19 Bermuda? How are young people going to survive obtaining jobs? We have a swath of graduates that actually didn't participate in the ceremony, but they're here in Bermuda now looking for a job. So I would hope that there is room for other subcommittees directly and to give these committees some teeth.
Yeah, but I want to qualify your statement there. I mean, I think we fleshed out.
Well, you can't qualify my statement.
That's true. Let me make a quick, I'm a nitpick at it there. Let me put it that way, because I think we can move on from this particular topic to the next soon. But there were two comments made that I just want to address, because it falls a bit in line with what I'm getting from you. Servio Cox says, even more importantly, this may not be a once in a lifetime event, and the young people may indeed face this again. This is the perfect time to have our younger people thinking and planning to lead. Linda Wilson says, the question here is, has any of them come forward or spoken to the finance minister to say, hey, what about a young person being involved? We have to understand at this point that we are in a very real situation and we are in a crisis. Thus, the people chosen are quite adequate for this time and dispensation. And then I heard from you, Eron, you were talking about students who perhaps are looking for jobs, who need to gain new skills, and that they'd benefit from being on the committee. I agree with all of those comments. However, I'm still getting a sentiment that putting young people on a committee sort of benefits the young people, but doesn't benefit the people on the actual committee, in the sense of they're learning, the young people are learning and gaining new leadership skills, as opposed to they're actually contributing something that otherwise wouldn't be contributed. And I'll give you an example on that. Universities, right? When you will know, because you're in university like me. When you're studying in a university, you benefit from real-time, up-to-date information on the changing climate, whether that's law, whether that's medicine. You're always up to date on the latest happenings, right? So a reputable business person, they get that practical experience. They're there in the hot seat, they're managing a situation, and experience and time is their asset. But I know that as a young person, we probably have access to the latest information that people who are already in the industry won't necessarily have immediate access to. I'm talking about those research papers, those academic journals, the latest intelligentsia that's going on and being discussed in a university environment. So as far as I'm concerned, anybody that's been outside of a university setting for more than 5 or 10 years is going to be out of date, no matter how hard they try. You can do a professional course on the side, you can go to a workshop or a conference, but young people are the ones who are really going to be up to the latest when it comes to modernization, the recent trends, and all those sorts of things. So I think we have to view it as not just young people benefiting from being on a committee or learning or taking up a seat, but at the same time, those young people are going to have revolutionary, radical ideas, which is what we need at a time like this. You mentioned cannabis. You know, these are things where for people our age, that's a given. Like, why haven't we done this yet? It's inequitable. It's something that produces funds and puts them in the right direction. And we know that particularly in many persons in the older generation, this is still a novel idea that they're still sort of weaving their way around. So I just wanted to address that point, because I think it's important to recognize that having young people in the room does not mean that the young people are the only ones gaining here.
Right. No, I would agree with you, Ryan. I would agree with you. So moving on with respect to the issues that we discussed with the Premier, one thing that I didn't get to discuss was a reduction in cabinet. So we've got two particular ministries, or ministers rather, that have responsibilities that is unclear to me will be required. If this was solely a business decision, those positions, in my view, would be made redundant. And that is the ministry without portfolio and the ministry of the cabinet office, right? So we've got civil servants who are in charge of cabinet. We've got a leader of the cabinet that's a civil servant. And one would have thought that those responsibilities could be attributed to that individual, and that we could save the public in excess of, some $300,000. And I don't want to put anybody out of a job. That's not what we're saying here. That again, as the Premier said, this is not personal, it is business, and we've got to make some serious hard decisions. So perhaps we can get to ask him specifically on that. We didn't see that as a part of the government's proposals thus far. We've seen a 15% reduction in the income for cabinet members and a 12.5% reduction. But I just think in the face of so many Bermudians, even when you look at a number like 2,000 of the hospitality workers who are out of work right now and receiving unemployment benefits for only 12 weeks, that we've got to seriously make some of those hard decisions.
Well, when it comes to the two portfolios that you've spoken to, I mean, they make how much a year? You're talking about savings of approximately what, 300,000? I mean, on the grand scale of things, can you justify why that's necessary? Does that come down to
on that basis? On that basis, then the government shouldn't be taking a pay cut at all, right? So the reality of it is that saving 15% from cabinet members and 12.5% from MPs is not a percentage marker at all on the grand scheme of things. So it's really a non-starter to make that point if we are acknowledging the fact that the government have taken an approach of saying, hey, look, we're going to take the step of showing shared sacrifice by giving a 15% reduction in the payroll.
So are you saying it's symbolic then?
What's that?
It's symbolic then.
Yes, it's tokenism. It's symbolism. When in reality, you look at the 15% reduction in the cabinet salaries, that doesn't even equal the two salaries that I'm saying to cut total. So if you really want to make a more substantive one, you don't have to reduce your salaries because you can
just lay one or two people off altogether.
Right. And it's not about the individuals. Let me make that very clear. It's not about the individuals. We're talking about, are we going to really make substantive decisions? And if we are making symbolic shared sacrifice, then perhaps it should have a little more gravamen than what it has right now. And that's the reality of it. I agree with you that even that reduction right there is not substantial when you're looking at our debt ceiling. It does when you're looking at our budget altogether. It's not substantial. But if you're going to take a symbolic step, perhaps it should have a little more teeth.
Okay. I mean, I can see that. I can see the point that you're making. On the topic of the symbolism, I'd be very curious, and I know that obviously we'll probably never get this answer, but I'd be very curious to hear whether that decision surrounding the pay cuts was made before or after the decision to propose to the government workers that they take a pay cut. And I say that because we heard just in advance of the weekend, there were some rumblings where government had made a proposal to the BPSU for a pay cut of, I believe it was, what was it, 10%? And we sort of got some leaked details there, right, around the negotiations. And then just on Monday at the latest press conference, the premier sort of announced at the end, he just let it slip that the cabinet ministers and later the MPs were also considering taking a pay cut. So I'm wondering, was that symbolism sort of taken in advance? Did government, when they said, hey, we're going to try and save some money on these civil servants, did they say at the same time, hey, well, we also need to lead from the front and take a cut? Or did they wait for that backlash to come from the president of the BPSU and then say, okay, we need something a little bit more because we're not going to get them with this 10%?
And I thought it was really interesting. I mean, yeah, we're talking about the shared sacrifice and but when the premier's rebuttal to the point or the question rather on cannabis, quite frankly, I was there at the press conference because I asked the question about recreation.
And the indication was that it was not on the front burner. It was something that was being pushed back and was under consideration right now.
An indication kind of leaves it that is an inference to be drawn. The response simply was that some things, in response to a question on recreational cannabis, the response was some things that were on the front burner will no longer be on the front burner. They're going to have to be moved to the back burner. And I appreciated why, because we were in the heat of the COVID-19, the pandemic. That I can understand that. But now we're talking about economic recovery and stimulus.
It needs to be put back on the front burner.
It needs to be put back on the front burner yesterday and tabled in Parliament tomorrow. Those are more substantive measures than, for example, taking a 12.5% or 15% reduction in pay, or even what I suggested, cutting those two ministries. These are substantial. And the premier said, well, look, if I told everybody they could grow their own weed and sell it tomorrow, then those 2,000 people aren't going back to work. And I think that was a bit facetious, right? Because the reality of the situation is we're talking about a tourism product, right?
Well, we're not just talking about a tourism product. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. I mean, places that have legalized cannabis did not just see people sitting around smoking weed and getting high. And exactly. I think that for a young premier, I think we need to be very careful around those statements because we've already seen the reports surrounding the inequity and the inequality and the stereotypes that come along with cannabis. And that was, to me, a bit disheartening, and I'll be honest with that. And I would say that to the premier if he were back on here and we had more than 30 minutes, because I think we have to be very careful with the research now. We're not in the 1980s anymore or the 1960s. There's been plenty of research produced to demonstrate why cannabis criminalization has been harmful, particularly to the PLP base. And so we have to be very careful. Beyond that, it's not just a matter of getting people high and smoking weed. We're talking about an industry where when you look at places like Canada, when you look at places like Colorado that have legalized cannabis, they've seen their economies turn around overnight. Even in the response to this immediate pandemic, in places that had legalized cannabis, I don't know if you saw in the news, but the second that government said we're going to begin shutting down stores and recreational facilities, people were lining up to buy cannabis. And that's not something that people are doing just to sit around and get high off of. We're talking about something that has medicinal benefits. We're talking about something that's, just as beneficial to your economy as alcohol and any other product that's being sold. And so I think what we have to talk about here, go ahead.
No, but I mean, just look at it, for instance, right? We were in shelter in place. and there was a reduction in the supply or availability of tobacco and alcohol in stores. And with the quickness, the premier posted to his Twitter to say, "Don't worry,
We're not taking your alcohol. You know I love my swivel."
we'll sort that out." He ran it to the extent to say, "Look, you guys, I like my have a little casual drink every now and again. I'll make sure, don't panic." And so when we're talking about cannabis and the economic side of it, not somebody's personal decision of why they use it and how they use it, the response is, "Well, I just don't want to let people just go and get high. That's not what this is about." And that's a bit disheartening. But perhaps, again, we'll see, as the premier said, that the legislation would, and I think he mentioned in the press conference that the legislation would be coming in May. It's May 21st. So hopefully that's this Friday or next Friday. Yeah. Because, again, we'll have to question as to where that legislation is. We need a stimulus in our economy. We need to shape Bermuda in a different fashion than it was pre-COVID-19 if we're going to survive.
Anna Pereira says turning around economies is a bit of a stretch. I mean, Anna, I don't think that we're saying that cannabis is going to be the panacea. However, when you really look at the cannabis market, it's something that's continuously growing, right? We're not just talking about economic benefits, though. We're talking about from a position of equity and fairness. Government has recognized the damage that cannabis criminalization has done to our communities. We're talking about our prison populations. We're talking about getting people back to work. And I think we have to, this is one of those things to me personally that we should have done a long time ago, but something like this really gives us an opportunity to seize on that. And I'll take it a step further. When you look at places that have legalized cannabis, Canada, when you look at places like Amsterdam, none of those have been popular tourist destinations as it relates to our top competitors, right? How many places in the world can you go and sit on a beach and sort of have a joint and have that sort of enjoyment? Nowhere. This is something that other countries, in particular Jamaica and Barbados, have looked at considering doing, Trinidad and Tobago. And this is really an opportunity, in my opinion, for Bermuda to take the lead. We're talking about stimulus. We're talking about economic recovery. We have to start talking about things that have been, quote unquote, on the table for a long time.
And specifically, cannabis is one of those things, because it's not a defined industry right now here in Bermuda. The government has the opportunity to determine who will benefit. And as he concluded, the premier said, "Well, we're going to make decisions that the people that ordinarily get the money, we need to make decisions to ensure that people who ordinarily don't get the money, rather get the money, and we have a redistribution of wealth." Well, here's an opportunity. Here's a red herring. Here's a brilliant opportunity.
The same hotel workers who are out of work, the same people coming out of prison who already... Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about particular brethren that I know, right? Some people lost their job during this pandemic. And to be honest with you, a lot of them are people that do not have the opportunity or the privilege of being able to look nice and put on a suit and go into an international business and sit down for an interview. You're talking about your truckers. You're talking about your tradespeople. You're talking about your farmers. You're talking about people who maybe have criminal records. What are these people going to do? They already had trouble getting a job before. Now, even good, upstanding, quote unquote, citizens don't have a job. How are we going to get these people working? How are we going to prevent crimes, robberies? How are we going to prevent those things from going on? We have to look at industries where the person, the common man on the ground, can get a head start. This is what we would call in economics or business terms, blue waters. And so just to expand on that a bit, when you look at the blue ocean theory, you have red oceans. If you imagine a shark, you're going into the ocean. If the water's red, that means there's a lot of sharks, there's a lot of fish being eaten. It's an area of the ocean that has a lot of activity. It's not new, it's not innovative. When you look at a blue ocean, you're talking about clear, peaceful waters where there's plentiful fish, and all you need is one shark to come in and seize on that. Cannabis, and particularly in Bermuda and in the world, because it's so new when it comes to legalizing it, is a blue ocean in the sense that, like you said, Eron, we have a prime opportunity to define what this market looks like. The premier can say, we're going to legalize this as part of our economic recovery plan, and these are the measures we're going to implement to allow that to happen. Legally, it's possible. We've seen it done. Before we said we'd waited to see what other countries do. We've now seen places like Canada do it. We've seen places in Europe and places in the US move to do it. And it's a missed opportunity if we don't. And I mean, while we're on the captain of the ship theme today, Eron, my concern here is that when we're talking about things like unemployment benefits and government's response so far, we're trying to plug holes in the ship as opposed to steering it in the right direction. And we're plugging the tiniest little holes, stop gaps that will extend us and put us on survival mode for the next month, maybe the next few weeks.
Well,
And we're not looking at where we're headed. We're heading into a big crashing island rock again. And
Ryan, I was just gonna say, right, that the ship is not that it's holes in the ship, right? And this is not the fault of the government. This is a national health. This is an international health pandemic, right? So the ship has crashed. We are ashore at the moment, and the question is: do we take the ship that's sinking with holes in the bottom of the boat and just go back into the middle of the Atlantic the way we were, or do we take time to build another ship and head in a different direction than where we saw the storm?
Some things and plant some new land and I appreciate that. I mean, ultimately, what I would say in closing on that particular topic is the research is out there. It's not a matter of what anybody thinks, of what our opinions are. The research is there. The reports have been done. We know that cannabis is a growing economy, a growing market. We know that it's based off of its criminalization. The very origins of cannabis laws and policies were based off of racial prejudices. They disenfranchised a lot of people and put a lot of people out of the ability to participate in our economy. We know that this current crisis has decimated things like tourism, and we have to do something new. When the world starts to open up again, we're going to see Barbados, Bahamas, Jamaica. We're going to be competing with all of those countries for tourists to come back again. And I don't think that our clean, safe, and close strategy is something that's going to put us above a place like Bahamas or a place like Jamaica, where they have gaming, where they have access to cannabis, or they have access to different things and at a cheaper price. So if this is what we're coming up with so far, I think we have to do a little bit more. We have to be a bit more innovative, and we genuinely have to do things we haven't done before.
And as we start to head towards the conclusion of today's show, let's touch on the other topic that we discussed, which was the Caroline Bay issue. Do you believe you got a sufficient response on that? I agreed with the Premier that there was no need for a commission of inquiry, but do you think we got a sufficient enough response on why or the action that's being taken, or the inaction rather?
We got a bit of a legalese answer there. Sort of.
Some Judas say that's an OVA term, isn't it?
No, I mean, really, it's a deal, right, which we all know was bad. It's something which Minister Curtis Dickinson said we're still investigating and trying to get to the bottom of. But I think what people are expecting is a little bit more action on that. When you look at sort of historically, things that have happened in this country's history. We've had controversial things with regard to, for example, the airport deal. We've had hotel guarantees of 200 plus years. When you look at this to me is one of the largest, most significant events in our modern history. You're talking about a single project costing this country over $165 million. You're talking about an event that led our government to raise the debt ceiling. That was before this particular event. And then in the midst of all of this crisis, we've had people from that particular project come back and ask for more. They want to turn it into a family office place after they've already.
Billionaires.
What's that?
For billionaires.
Yeah, I mean, we have to really look back and say, now, hold up, wait a minute. We have people on unemployment here. We're talking about a deal that was already bad, and in my opinion, already should have been investigated to see how we can recuperate, how we can sort of get to the bottom of this situation. And now people are asking for more, and I take issue to that, and I take exception to that. And I think, as the Premier admitted himself, it's that controversy there. It's an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment. So I think we need to see a little bit more and talk a bit about this Caroline Bay deal. What is going to be the future of Caroline Bay? How are we going to turn this around so that we're turning lemons into lemonade, if that's possible? And we need to investigate how we got there in the first place. And so the Premier, if he's not going to admit to a commission of inquiry or a particular line or quote unquote making policy in a press conference,
take it back.
Right. I think he needs to at least commit to investigating a particular objective or an aim. The aim is not to find out that it was bad, because we already are there. We know that it's bad, but we can't just take that. We have to go and look a little bit further and say, well, what are we going to do now to make amends?
Well, they've said what they're going to do. They said that they're coming to a resolution. The project has been placed in the hands of joint provisional liquidators with a view to identifying a way forward as to how can we use this land for the benefit in the existing structure. But the existing structure sees the current owners of the land that's subdivided into all of these different companies with the same beneficial owners The reality is that they've told you we're going to work under the existing structure. So the question, that's why I asked the question to the Premier, why don't we just take it back? And no, I concede with him that it's not as cut and dry as that, right? But the Premier knows that Section 13 of the Constitution allows us to appropriate land in certain circumstances, so long as those circumstances are fit. And when you have circumstances where that land has cost the taxpayers $165 plus million, one would argue that that test is satisfied. And when you look at the adequate compensation test that's triggered also in Section 13, when you take somebody's property, what is the value of that property that you have to pay when there are charges on that land? Up to $80 million. And the Premier knows that. So the value of it, what are you actually going to have to pay if you take it back when we're talking about equitable compensation? There's an argument there.
Yeah, I mean, overall, we're talking about something that's been dragged out over the course of a decade, right, and ended horribly and at a cost to the taxpayers. I know that Anna Pereira is suggesting that it's chump change in comparison to the 2.9 billion. I mean, our current debt is something that's been accumulated since 2000, I think 7 or 8, right? That's something that's taking years of time to develop, and I would agree that 2.9 billion is certainly a lot, but you're talking about one single deal here costing 165 million. And if that's our current practice, to just dismiss that as chump change, then I think we're going to see a lot more than 2.9 billion. Overall, we need to take accountability. That's a large topic when it comes to looking at debt.
I think to be fair to Alan, she can correct me if I'm wrong. I think she was referring to her earlier comment where she projected a local spend of 300 million with respect to cannabis being chump change.
Okay, maybe.
And she can correct me if I'm wrong, but I wouldn't want to, misconstrue her intention there.
Okay. Lastly, Aaron, I think the other thing we talked about briefly was the cost of living.
Yes.
We heard some interesting things surrounding tax relief on the energy companies. We heard about requiring grocery stores to, for example, list their prices. Now, I know that government is talking about deferring import duties for businesses. What do you think surrounding the cost of living?
What do I think? Well,
Yeah.
I think I've made that very much clear by way of the questions in the press conferences, and that was that the government ought to legislate the reduction in prices. That let's have I think it's your idea, so I don't want to take it out of your mouth now that you've asked me the question, but the competition authority to regulate the prices of our retail establishments and some of our food establishments.
Yeah, I mean, so when you look at places like the United States and the EU and Europe, you have long established things that regulate things like unfair trade and price fixing and cartels. That's not something that we have in Bermuda. We don't even have, for example, the Unfair Contract Terms Act, which you mentioned that they have in England. Overall, there's very little consumer protection in Bermuda against things like artificial price fixing. So I think I was surprised to hear things like tax relief on energy and requiring stores to submit their prices. But I think we also have to look at the consumer side, because at the present moment, there's nothing stopping our monopolies and places like, even when you look at our cell phone companies, right? I remember at the beginning of this century, we had multiple internet and data companies. You had Transat, you had Northrop, you had Logic, you had all sorts of M3 Wireless. And now we've been reduced to sort of two very large conglomerates that provide your cable, your internet, your cell phone. And I think that there's nothing, and I'm not suggesting that they're doing this, but we need an authority or a regulatory body that can look at situations like that and sort of jump in when we think that a situation is being created where we may be heading towards a monopoly, or a situation where companies, grocery stores are colluding to increase prices artificially. So that's what I would like to see when it comes to that. The other thing I was thinking about was that prior to this crisis, Aaron, a lot of countries around the world had already established things like a minimum wage. I mean, Bermuda is so far behind. Other countries, they've had a minimum wage, they've moved towards livable wages. And now when you look at places like Spain, because of this pandemic in particular, they're even talking about things like a universal basic income, where everybody from based off of the taxes or international businesses or whatever, everybody gets a certain percentage or a certain income to at least provide them with basic needs. What are you thinking around Bermuda's position in respect to that?
Well, when you really look at the situation, you've got to really ask yourself, what can we do as a jurisdiction here in Bermuda that's different, right? So the Premier has said to in the press conferences that we're going to look at other jurisdictions and we're not looking at other jurisdictions. But the reality is we got to look at our situation here in Bermuda. So the fact of the matter is we have to get people in the room to make decisions to say, well, what is going to be in the best interest of Bermuda? So we can look at other jurisdictions and what they're doing there. And this is where I tend to agree with the Premier in some respects, right? We can look at other jurisdictions, we can copy and paste what they're doing, or we can ask ourselves, what's going to work for us here? That's the reality. And we have monopolies here in Bermuda. And we know what those monopolies are. One of those monopolies announced a 50% reduction in their employees' wages, right? And those was a series of companies. So when we're looking at the situation, it's not so much, I mean, when you look at other countries, there are a swath of monopolies. There are a swath of different competitions and companies. Here in Bermuda, you could dwindle on both of my hands, you could count the major employers. So there's not really a revolutionary or brilliant idea that needs to be done. I think that we're really scared to make those decisions because, and we've discussed it, let's really be frank here. When we talk about cost of living and we're looking at the grocery stores, you're not so much talking about shareholders as much as you're looking at Belco and you look at shareholders. But there are interests. In Bermuda, there are intertwined interests as to why the decisions aren't being made. So it's not that, hey, look, what do I think or what does the Premier or his cabinet think about the decisions we could make? The reality is that there are intertwined interests and you cannot just pull the plug and make those legislative amendments because there are consequences to that. And let's just boil it down really, really quickly for the sake of our guests. And I think this is important because it's one thing that people don't touch on. And that's the fact that our leaders, particularly when we're looking at this government, we've got mortgages. That's the reality. So when you talk about a government and say, for example, you want to reduce the cost of living by regulating interest rates, well, the man, Mr. Bank, calls and says, well, hey, listen, you want to pass that legislation? I don't think you want to do that because this mortgage that you still owe X, Y, Z on, that is the reality of the island that we're living in. When we look at the oligarchy, right? So
very incestuous, a lot of things intertwined. So what I think what you're getting at, Eron, is that it's not a question of, well, what will we do? What ideas can we come up with? It's more so a matter of we already know things that should happen in order to correct certain issues, and we're simply hesitant to do them for other reasons. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That the reality is it's not. It doesn't lie within my mouth to say, well, what should we do? We know what we need to do. The question is having the discussion in the community and building a sense of cohesiveness and fortitude that we can make these decisions without fear. That we heard this I don't say nonsense. We heard this notion. We heard this notion of without fear or favor. But the reality is that fear is really the premise of a lot of our decisions or failure to make other decisions. And when you're looking at it objectively, you can sympathize with the individuals because just put yourself in that position that the example that I've just given you. So there's not a sharp criticism there. It's how do we resolve it as a collective, us at the bottom of society saying, how are we going to change it? We have to have each other's back. We have to understand that your issues are my issues. We need to be able to step in and we talked about a co-op, right? We talked about co-op banks here in Bermuda. We talked about having grocery stores. We need to be able to unite in that respect to be able to say, well, yeah, we have this type of collective identity and unity to make those decisions without fear or favor. Otherwise, when we say fear or favor, it's just double speak.
So let me ironically ask you, keeping in mind that, and I accept everything that you're saying, that we genuinely know the solutions to a lot of these problems and we just haven't done them. With that in mind, ironically, I'm going to ask you, what's your idea on how do we fix that?
How do we fix it?
How do we fix it? If your position is that perhaps even the government at the highest levels of politics in this country are aware of certain corrective measures that should be implemented in order to fix particular issues, whether that's price fixing, monopolies, the cost of living, the banks, the accessibility of business establishment. If we already know that these are the issues and we know very direct solutions to them and we haven't done them, what now? What are you telling us to do?
I think it's a good question from the perspective that we are young Bermudians and that we have an opportunity. It's not going to happen. I mean, I want to be quite frank. And we have these discussions. The only reason that I engage in these discussions, Ryan, is because I want to stimulate the conversation amongst young people like you and I that will inherit the Bermuda in the next 10, 15 years. The reality of it is, though, speaking quite frankly, it's not going to happen with this government and I hate to say, I don't want to say the next, because if this is the same government that comes, and the reason is that we don't have that collective identity at present. This is an opportunity in the midst of a health pandemic to develop that collective identity, to recognize that certain decisions need to be made. They can't be made for fear of reprisal or otherwise. So how can I be my brother's keeper to ensure that when the premier or the finance minister makes or tables a piece of legislation, nobody's going to take his house away? Or there are wealthy Black Bermudians. There are wealthy Bermudians that share in a vision of a collective identity and want to eradicate this notion of two Bermudas, right? So it's not about how do we solve it? It's not the action. You're going to need legislative amendments, right? We have
so it's a mindset shift that we need.
It's a mindset shift. There's a planning. There's also a planning. And I think when you look at it from, we touched on it earlier with respect to ministers and them having various delegations of responsibilities. For example, my vision of government in the next 10, 15 years is that you know that you have a background in law. So at the time of the election, you're running on the basis that if you're elected, you will be the Attorney General of Bermuda, because that is your background. We have another individual who has a background in finance, and he has experience in finance. He's running at that time because he has a background in finance and he has the experience.
And
we know that he will be
the
finance minister. We know that somebody is a health economist. They've got experience in it. They will be our health ministers. But right now, it's almost a situation where, and you know what I think is, just put a pin in it really quickly. I think there's a beautiful thing of this discussion, particularly with our guest today, is that we're all Progressive Labour Party supporters. And you would never know that based on the discussion that we've had. And that's the reality of it. But I just want to put that pin in it there. But when you look at it and you say, we need to develop an elected or framework for elected leadership, that actually means that our elected leaders have qualifications, experience, and the requisite know-how in the ministries for which
they're. But what you're saying is that we already know. So expertise isn't the issue here, that it's the willpower. Because I mean, I'm going to quote a phrase from the Honorable Premier Paula Cox, who said testicular fortitude. And I think that's what you were getting at earlier, that it's not a matter of a lack of experience and expertise. It's a matter of willpower to implement decisions that, being conducted. The reports have been done.
Ryan, to be clear, what I'm saying is that there is a plan to identify a team, and that team has a plan before the election to go in with an objective. Before that team actually declares that, hey, we're running for the election, you're going to make sure that, you know what, Ryan, you've had a successful career, you've had your money tucked away, you are financially stable. And when they call and say, they cannot call you rather and say that your mortgage is canceled. They cannot call you and say, hey, look, you're out of a job when you're finished politics. And if they do, you say, that's okay, I'm going on my boat and I'm going fishing, because I came into politics to make change, not for a job, right? And I think we're looking at the nub of the issue here, which is that, and this is with the greatest degree of respect for our elected officials, is that for a great majority of them, it is a job. And what do you think about in a job? You think about job security. So when you're talking about revolutionary ideas, like making drastic changes that have consequences to them, you're going to think about job security and what happens when I'm out of this politics thing. So what I'm saying, Ryan, and that's why I'm less than optimistic that the change will be made right now, and I'm more optimistic when you're looking at young people like you and I, because we have the opportunity to build our financial stability before entering into politics with a plan, with a determined team, so that, you know what, we're not fearful of making the decisions. It's there's a willpower. There's having the willpower, right? That's one thing. But then the other aspect of it is being able to be secure in the decisions. And how much can I criticize somebody for not making a decision when that actually has a contrary interest to
real consequences when it comes to their own survival? Yeah. I mean, that's a very good point, Eron. And I think if we went back to the original question I asked you as to what we do, I think what you're saying is that you're particularly looking to young Bermudians who perhaps are not in that position. They don't have those concerns around insecurity and survival. They don't have a family to take care of. They don't have a house to pay off. They genuinely can come back with passion and fire and expertise to genuinely make some changes in this country that put us on the right path. And I think what you're saying here is that if anybody's listening to us right now, that you're particularly speaking to young Bermudians, that they should go prepare themselves to lead, prepare themselves and put themselves in a position of stability so that when they come back to this island, or even if they're already here, that it's just a matter of forming people with a collective mindset, partnering together surrounding a particular objective, and being prepared to implement that objective, not to fill a job role, not to run and win an election and figure out who's going to be placed thereafter and how we're going to.
So we can fund our own elections, Ryan, because you cannot say that I'm going to cut Marketplace or Linda's or whoever else of a grocery store or insurance company or whatever large company here in Bermuda, say that you're going to make drastic change and then need them in 16 months when it's time for an election.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that we have to have a plan. And that's why I'm optimistic that young people can actually develop that plan, gain that experience, secure that financial stability so that we can make the change. Because I think deep in the hearts of many of our politicians today, they want to make the change, but there's that conflict.
They're working with their hands tied behind their back.
So I think we're on the hour and 30 minutes mark, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a good position to leave it. I mean, we've had some conversation with the Premier today who was gracious enough to give us an extension of time beyond the 30 minutes that we originally planned. It's been a great series. I don't know what our viewer count was like today, but I saw quite a lot of engagement from the listening public. We got a lot of questions covered with him in a very short amount of time, and we got a commitment that he's willing to come back. So that was great. And then for the rest of it, we got to talk a little bit about what we thought about his comments, some things that have been on our minds lately, and we got to have some really good engagement with our viewers. So thank you, Anna Pereira, Talon Clark, my girl Judith Parsons. It was back today. I didn't see Connect Island Empress Burgess, but somebody tell her we were looking forward today. But thank you. We genuinely appreciate. I see Daniel Woods. Thanks. So we're grateful to the general listening public. And I'm particularly grateful to our young Bermudians, because when you really look at it, this crisis has gotten, Eron, I don't know if you noticed, a lot of young Bermudians switched on because we're genuinely concerned about what's the future of this island, what things are we going to fix that should have been fixed before, and how, most importantly, we're going to pressure our leaders to act in our best interest. And I'm not saying that they weren't doing that from the beginning, but they do sometimes need a little bit of a push. And so even with regards to this economic committee, I'm hoping that even if the Premier said today that he doesn't interfere in the decisions made by his ministers per se, that we will see a shift.
Well, one thing is clear. One thing is clear is that what we've said here today, certainly the Premier acted on it, because he pulled out his phone and said, I'm going to send that young man a text right now to check on the Bermudianized model.
That's true.
So hopefully we see that. So, I mean, hope. We still have hope. Hope springs eternal. I know that the Premier, he does make comments, but he's not bound by those comments, and he will reflect on them, no doubt. That is incumbent upon any responsible leader. So again, I'd like to thank the Premier for taking time. Hopefully we can get him on. Perhaps we can get him and the Finance Minister on at the same time. I think that will be ideal, so that we can make sure that everybody's at the table, so to speak, right? To see what's on it and what's not on it.
And everybody's on the same page.
Right. But Ryan, I think that we will wrap up now. So again, thanks to our guest, our special guest, the Honorable Premier. Thank you to you, Ryan, for engaging me in an interesting debate. Thank you to our viewers and those who stay engaged. And until next time.
Yeah, and thanks to our essential workers. And again, we send our condolences to those impacted by the current COVID-19 crisis. So thanks again. We appreciate you. Thank you, Eron. Thanks to the Premier again for sharing his time with us today. And we look forward to seeing you next time.